Racist cop mocks black woman on trial. Unaware, she leads the FBI. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Meet Officer James Sullivan. He was a seasoned cop with a reputation for handling high-pressure situations, but there was one thing that always seemed to accompany him: his arrogance. Sullivan was a white, middle-aged man who had risen through the ranks of the police force largely due to his brash attitude and no-nonsense approach. However, there was one problem: his deep-rooted bias. He never made a secret of his belief that people of color were somehow less in his eyes, and it showed in the way he treated people. As Sullivan stood in the courtroom, with his uniform pressed to perfection and a smug look on his face, he was confident that nothing could rattle him. Today's case was no different. He would win, as always. The defendant, a woman named Angela Williams, sat at the front of the courtroom, facing the judge with a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside of her. Angela was a black woman, in her early 30s, and she had been charged with a crime that seemed small compared to the vast injustices she'd experienced throughout her life. Yet, Sullivan's treatment of her was anything but professional. As the trial proceeded, Sullivan's sneers became more pronounced. He mocked Angela in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. His smirk could be seen when he addressed her in a condescending tone, questioning her every move and making sarcastic remarks about her demeanor. The crowd watched, some with eyes wide in disbelief, others in shock, but no one dared to speak up. Sullivan knew his power in the courtroom, and he wasn't afraid to use it to belittle someone he deemed beneath him. Angela, however, did not flinch. Her eyes remained steady, her expression unreadable, though inside, a storm of emotions raged. She had been through far worse in her life than this man could ever imagine. Sullivan's comments continued throughout the day, each one more cutting than the last. But Angela remained composed, answering his questions with precision, keeping her responses sharp and direct. She wasn't about to let him break her down. As the day wore on, Sullivan felt a sense of satisfaction. He had the upper hand, and nothing was going to change that. But little did he know, he was about to find out something that would shake him to his core. Angela wasn't just any ordinary woman sitting in that courtroom. She wasn't someone to be belittled or dismissed. Angela Williams was far more than just a defendant. She was a leader. And that would soon become very clear to Officer Sullivan. As the trial dragged on, Sullivan continued his smug behavior, unaware of the truth that would soon be revealed. Angela Williams wasn't just fighting for her own dignity today. She was fighting for something far more important. And Sullivan? He was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Angela sat still, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Officer Sullivan continued his mocking tone, his smug demeanor never faltering. It was as though he had complete control over the room, over the situation. But Angela knew better. She had lived through enough to recognize when someone underestimated her. Sullivan's ignorance was nothing new. In fact, it was almost predictable. He had been like this with every person of color he encountered. Quick to assume, quick to judge. But Angela wasn't just any ordinary person. She wasn't the kind of woman who would cower or shrink back from such insults. No, she had learned long ago that the only way to deal with people like Sullivan was to remain calm, composed, and always several steps ahead. As Sullivan continued with his condescending questions, Angela's mind raced. She knew how this game worked. She had seen it all before. The dismissive tones, the sarcastic smirks, the casual disregard for her as an individual. But she also knew that every insult hurled her way only served to fuel the fire inside her. And today, she was going to make sure that fire burned brighter than ever before. Sullivan, oblivious to the growing tension in the room, continued to press her with questions that were both irrelevant and degrading. His tone was dismissive, as though he didn't believe for a second that a woman like Angela could possibly have any authority, let alone be someone of importance. He continued to poke at her, asking questions that had nothing to do with the case at hand. But Angela's focus never wavered. She answered each question with calm precision, her voice steady, her words measured. She wasn't about to let him bait her into a reaction. Meanwhile, the courtroom had begun to shift. A few people in the back were whispering to each other, some glancing over at Angela with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. They had all witnessed Sullivan's behavior, but they didn't understand why she wasn't reacting. They couldn't fathom how she remained so composed. What they didn't know was that Angela was more than just a woman on trial. She had walked into this courtroom not as a defendant, but as someone far more powerful. She had been trained to handle situations like this, trained to control her emotions, her reactions, and her words. She had been prepared for moments like these. As the trial continued, Sullivan grew more and more confident in his position. He believed he had Angela cornered, that he had broken her down in front of the entire courtroom. But he was wrong. Angela wasn't broken. Far from it. She was simply biding her time, waiting for the right moment. And soon, that moment would come. As the day wore on, the tension in the room built to a near palpable level. Sullivan's taunts grew louder, but Angela's composure remained unshaken. It was as though nothing could touch her. The clock ticked on, each minute dragging on, but Angela knew that the longer Sullivan kept up his insults, the closer she was to revealing the truth. The courtroom was about to see something they hadn't expected, something that would change everything. Sullivan didn't know it yet, but the woman he had been mocking, the woman he had been belittling, was about to turn the tables on him in the most unexpected way. As the trial approached its final moments, Angela straightened up at her seat, ready. The time had come for her to reveal what Sullivan had no idea about. She wasn't just any woman on trial. She was someone who held power far beyond the confines of this courtroom. She was the head of the FBI, and Sullivan would soon find out exactly who he was dealing with. As the trial came to a close, the air in the courtroom seemed to grow thicker, charged with a tension that everyone could feel but no one dared to address. Officer Sullivan stood tall, his chest puffed out in pride, completely unaware that the woman he had belittled and mocked for hours was no ordinary defendant. He looked around the room, glancing at the judge, the prosecutor, and even the defense attorney, who all seemed strangely silent. Sullivan felt a sense of victory building inside him. He was confident that Angela's defense had crumbled under the weight of his relentless questions. He had done his job, and he had done it well. Little did he know, this was the moment that would define the entire trial. As the judge wrapped up his statements, Angela finally rose from her seat. Her movements were deliberate, each step measured. She wasn't in a rush. She had already done everything she needed to do. Angela's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had been swirling around her for the past few hours. She turned to face the judge and the entire courtroom, her voice steady and clear as she addressed everyone present. "Your Honor," Angela began, her tone firm but respectful, "I have one final statement to make before this trial concludes." Sullivan's smirk faltered for a moment. He wasn't sure what she was doing, but he wasn't worried. He was sure the case was in the bag for him. The judge nodded for her to continue, giving her the floor. Angela took a deep breath, then spoke the words that would forever change the course of the trial. "I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she announced. The room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Officer Sullivan's eyes widened in disbelief, his smug expression melting away into confusion. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The whispers in the courtroom began to spread like wildfire as people tried to process the revelation. Angela, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had assumed was just a regular defendant in a case that he could easily win, was the head of the FBI. The woman who had sat in front of him for hours, calmly answering every question without so much as flinching, was in charge of one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country. Sullivan's mind raced. How could he have missed something so crucial? He had been so focused on her race, so sure that she was beneath him, that he had failed to recognize the truth. Angela wasn't just some woman sitting in a courtroom. She was someone with the power to shape the future of law enforcement in America. Sullivan had no idea what he had just walked into. As Angela stood there, watching the realization dawn on Sullivan's face, she didn't gloat. There was no need for it. Her power was clear, and she didn't have to prove it to anyone. The truth had already spoken for itself. Angela remained calm, knowing that Sullivan's ignorance and prejudice had led him to this very moment. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would stay with him for the rest of his career. The silence in the room was deafening, but it was broken by the sound of the judge clearing his throat. "Officer Sullivan, perhaps you now understand the gravity of the situation," the judge said, his voice stern. Sullivan nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. The trial had taken a turn he never saw coming, and it was clear to everyone in the room that Angela had just won, not because of the case, but because of the revelation that had just unfolded. Sullivan had no choice but to sit back and accept the truth. He had just crossed paths with someone far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. In the silence that followed Angela's revelation, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone in the room, from the jury to the defense attorney, sat frozen in place, trying to process what had just been said. Officer Sullivan, who had spent the entire day mocking Angela, now stood with his mouth agape, struggling to find words. His mind raced, but no coherent thought could form. He had underestimated her. He had assumed that her calm demeanor was a sign of weakness, that her race and her status as a defendant made her someone easy to dismiss. But he had been wrong. The shock on Sullivan's face was evident, his entire body stiff with disbelief. He had no idea that the woman he had been mocking for hours, the one he had treated with such contempt, was the head of the very organization that had the power to hold him accountable. Angela, on the other hand, stood still, her expression unwavering. She wasn't here for revenge. She wasn't here to rub his face in the fact that he had been wrong about her. She was here to make sure that justice was served, and to show that power doesn't always come in the form that people expect. "You didn't know, did you?" Angela's voice was calm, but filled with an undeniable strength. Sullivan blinked, trying to come to terms with the reality that had just been laid before him. His arrogance, his prejudice, had led him to this moment, a moment where he was not only facing the woman he had wronged, but also the leader of the FBI, an institution he had spent his career working alongside, yet never once considered could be led by someone like Angela. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted to apologize, but the realization that he had so deeply insulted someone of Angela's stature made it seem impossible. He was still trapped in his own ignorance. The judge cleared his throat again, the moment of awkwardness hanging heavy in the air. "Officer Sullivan, I believe this is a lesson you will not soon forget," the judge said, his voice stern but not unkind. Sullivan slowly nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. He wanted to shrink away, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in his own moment of reckoning. Angela's eyes remained fixed on him, but there was no anger in them, only quiet resolve. She wasn't interested in his apology. She wasn't interested in making him feel guilty. What she wanted was for him to understand the consequences of his actions, for him to see the very real impact of the kind of prejudice he had so easily dismissed. She had been his target today, but he had no idea just how powerful a target she was. Angela turned away from Sullivan, addressing the courtroom now, her words directed at everyone in the room. "I'm here today, not just as a victim, but as a representative of something far larger than myself," she continued. "My position, my power, is not for me to flaunt or use for personal gain. It is a responsibility to ensure that justice is done, that the laws we enforce apply equally to everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from." Her words hung in the air, a reminder of the truth that had been right in front of everyone the entire time. Power does not discriminate based on race, gender, or background. Angela was a leader, not because of who she was, but because of the principles she stood for. The room remained silent, as if everyone needed a moment to digest what had just been revealed. Sullivan, still processing the shock, finally lowered his gaze. His face, once filled with arrogance, now showed only shame. He had been humbled in the most profound way. The judge nodded slowly, acknowledging Angela's statement with a quiet approval. The jury, too, seemed to take in her words, their faces reflecting the impact of what had just been shared. This trial had not been about the case at all, but about something far more significant. It had been about exposing the deeply ingrained biases that still existed in the system. It had been about showing that true power doesn't come from arrogance or prejudice, but from integrity, responsibility, and the ability to lead with dignity. The courtroom was still, the atmosphere thick with an almost tangible tension. Angela stood at the front, her posture tall and composed, while Sullivan remained seated, his face red with shame. The realization of what had just transpired was starting to settle in. He had underestimated Angela, not just as a woman of color, but as someone who had more power and influence than he could have ever imagined. For someone like Sullivan, who had always prided himself on his position and control, being confronted with the truth in such a public way was a humbling experience. He had made an enemy today, but not just any enemy. He had made an enemy who could change the course of his career. Angela, however, wasn't concerned with his career. She wasn't concerned with his personal feelings or his embarrassment. What mattered to her now was ensuring that the truth was not only understood, but acknowledged. She had faced injustice her entire life, and this was just another reminder of how deep those injustices ran in society. The case, which had begun as a simple legal proceeding, had now transformed into something far bigger. It was no longer just about the trial. It was about showing that the system could no longer turn a blind eye to the prejudice that had been woven into its fabric for so long. Sullivan's silence stretched on, and finally, he seemed to find his voice. But it wasn't the voice of the confident officer who had mocked Angela earlier. It was the voice of someone who had been caught off guard, someone who now recognized his mistake. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice barely audible. The words came out with an almost apologetic tone, but it was too late for that. Angela, ever composed, didn't react to his apology. She had no need to hear it. His apology wouldn't erase the damage, nor would it undo the way he had treated her. She had learned long ago that words were meaningless without action to back them up. The damage was done, and now Sullivan had to live with the consequences of his actions. The judge, observing the scene before him, finally spoke. "Officer Sullivan," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe this trial is over. It is clear that you have learned a valuable lesson today, one that will stay with you for the rest of your career. I suggest you take this moment to reflect on what has transpired." The judge's words were like a final nail in the coffin, a quiet yet powerful condemnation of Sullivan's actions. There was no need for further argument. The courtroom had already spoken. Angela's composure had won the day. As Sullivan sat, still processing everything, Angela turned toward the exit. She wasn't there to make a spectacle. She wasn't there to gloat. She had already won, not just the case, but the battle for respect and dignity. As she made her way out of the courtroom, she passed by the jury, each of their faces reflecting a mix of awe and understanding. They had witnessed something powerful today, not just the revelation of Angela's true identity, but the realization that power does not always look the way people expect it to. Angela Williams was a leader not because of her gender or her race, but because of her unwavering belief in justice and equality. She had earned her place at the top through hard work, resilience, and integrity. And as she walked out of that courtroom, Angela knew that her fight was far from over. The battle against prejudice and ignorance was ongoing, but today, she had taken a significant step forward. Sullivan's face, still flushed with embarrassment, would be a reminder to him of the lesson he had learned the hard way. For Angela, however, this moment would serve as a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she still had to go in her fight for justice. It had been a few days since the trial, but the effects of what had transpired still lingered in the air. Sullivan's face, still flushed with embarrassment, was a constant reminder to anyone who had witnessed the trial. Word had spread quickly about the revelation that Angela Williams, the woman Sullivan had so confidently mocked, was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The media had picked up on the story, and soon it was the talk of the town. Angela had become something of a hero in the eyes of many. Her calm demeanor throughout the trial, her ability to rise above the insults, and the powerful way she had revealed her true identity had struck a chord with people. She had done what many people wish they could do, stand up for themselves and demand respect, even in the face of ignorance and prejudice. But for Angela, it was never about the attention. It was never about becoming a symbol or a hero. She had made it clear during the trial that her role as the FBI director was not for personal gain. It was a responsibility, a duty to ensure that the laws of the land were applied fairly to all, regardless of race, background, or social standing. It had been a lesson in humility for Officer Sullivan, but was also a lesson for everyone who had watched the trial unfold. Angela had shown them all the power of resilience, the strength of standing tall in the face of adversity, and the importance of never letting anyone define your worth based on preconceived notions. The world, as it often does, seemed to forget the lessons it needed to learn. In the days following the trial, there was little public acknowledgement of the profound implications of what had occurred. People quickly moved on to the next story, the next piece of drama that filled the news cycle. But Angela did not forget. She could not forget. Her work was just beginning. As the days passed, Angela returned to her role at the FBI, but the weight of what had happened in that courtroom stayed with her. She knew that the battle against prejudice and discrimination was far from over. Sullivan's behavior was just a symptom of a much larger issue, one that was embedded in the very systems she worked within. And it was her job, her duty, to make sure that the work she did would help dismantle those systems piece by piece. Sullivan, for his part, had a long road ahead of him. He had been humbled, yes, but that didn't mean his prejudices would simply disappear. He would need to confront the reality of what had happened and learn from his mistakes. Angela knew that change wasn't easy. It wasn't something that could be achieved in one trial, one moment of revelation. It took time, effort, and, most importantly, a willingness to face the uncomfortable truths that lay beneath the surface. As the weeks passed, Angela remained focused on her mission, knowing that she had a responsibility to ensure that justice was not only done, but seen to be done. She had to fight not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been dismissed, overlooked, and treated unfairly simply because of who they were. The case with Sullivan, though a small victory in the grand scheme of things, had given her a renewed sense of purpose. She had seen firsthand how deep the roots of prejudice ran, and she had seen the power of standing up against it. She couldn't change the world overnight, but she could change the lives of the people who depended on her. That was what mattered most. As for Sullivan, his future was uncertain. The trial had shattered his sense of superiority, and the world now knew him for what he truly was, a man who had let his biases dictate his actions. Angela had taught him a hard lesson, one that he would likely carry with him for the rest of his life. But it wasn't just Sullivan who had been changed by the trial. The entire courtroom had witnessed a moment of clarity, a moment that reminded everyone in that room that true power comes from integrity, not arrogance. It was a lesson that Angela would carry with her every day as she continued to lead the FBI with the strength, dignity, and resolve that had earned her that position in the first place. It was a quiet evening when Angela received a phone call from the office. It wasn't unusual for her to work late, especially given the gravity of her role as the director of the FBI. But tonight, there was something different about the call. The voice on the other end was familiar, yet filled with an unusual sense of urgency. "Angela, we need to talk," said the voice. It was her deputy, Lisa, a loyal and trusted colleague who had been with the Bureau for years. "There's something we've uncovered, and it's big." Angela paused for a moment, her mind quickly processing the words. She could hear the tension in Lisa's voice. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but focused. Lisa hesitated, clearly weighing how to frame the news. "It's about Officer Sullivan," she began. Angela's immediate reaction was one of concern. Sullivan's actions during the trial had caused a stir, and although she hadn't expected any more direct fallout from it, she knew that people like Sullivan could often be unpredictable. "What about him?" Angela inquired. We've been monitoring him since the trial, Lisa continued. We've discovered some troubling connections. It seems Sullivan has been involved in activities that go against the very principles he was supposed to uphold as a law enforcement officer. Angela's stomach tightened. She had been through a lot, but this was different. The thought of a law enforcement officer using his position to further his own agenda was something that she could never accept. It wasn't just about Sullivan's personal failings anymore. It was about the integrity of the entire system. Angela took a deep breath, already making mental notes. Gather all the details and have them ready for me by tomorrow, she said. We need to act quickly. I don't want this to escalate any further. The call ended, and Angela sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had never been one to back down from a challenge. But now, she was faced with the very real possibility that Sullivan's actions had consequences that extended far beyond a simple trial. He had been exposed for his prejudices, but it seemed that there was far more to him than met the eye. Angela knew that the work she was doing with the FBI was bigger than just cases or trials. It was about setting the standard, about making sure that law enforcement truly served and protected, no matter who you were. The next morning, Angela met with her team. Lisa presented the evidence they had gathered, and it was worse than she had imagined. Sullivan had been involved in corrupt practices, taking bribes, and using his position to manipulate investigations for personal gain. The discovery sent a shockwave through the Bureau. Sullivan had been a figure many had trusted, his position granting him the benefit of the doubt. But now, it was clear that he had betrayed that trust, and the damage had to be contained before it spread any further. Angela knew that this wasn't just about removing Sullivan from his position. This was about sending a message. Law enforcement, at every level, had to be held accountable. She wasn't going to let one officer's actions undermine the integrity of the entire Bureau. As the day went on, Angela and her team worked tirelessly to ensure that Sullivan would face the consequences of his actions. The investigation was launched immediately, and within hours, Sullivan was removed from his post. Angela knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger process of reform, but it was a crucial step. She had exposed a flaw in the system, and now it was time to fix it. For Angela, this was yet another moment of growth, a reminder that the fight for justice was ongoing, and it required constant vigilance. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready for it. She had learned long ago that leadership was about doing what was right, even when it was difficult, and she was determined to continue leading with integrity, no matter the obstacles in her path. The investigation into Officer Sullivan's actions was only the beginning, but it set a tone that resonated throughout the entire Bureau. Angela was determined to ensure that the process of accountability went beyond just one officer. The system needed to be examined, questioned, and reformed. As the FBI director, Angela knew that her actions were under scrutiny, not just from the public, but from within her own organization. The pressure was immense, but it was a pressure she had always been accustomed to. For the next several weeks, Angela worked tirelessly with her team to assess the scope of the corruption that had been uncovered. Sullivan's misdeeds had been just a glimpse into a much larger problem. They discovered several other officers with questionable connections, each implicated in a variety of unethical practices. It became clear that Sullivan was not the exception, but rather part of a systemic issue that had festered within the organization for years. Angela was not content to just address the symptoms. She was committed to eradicating the root causes. The problem was more than just individual officers. It was a culture of privilege, bias, and a lack of accountability that had allowed such behavior to persist unnoticed. The stakes were high, and the path ahead was fraught with challenges. The public was watching, the media was reporting, and there was no room for mistakes. But Angela remained resolute. She had spent her entire career breaking barriers, facing down challenges that many thought insurmountable. This was no different. The next step was to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, not just among the public, but within the Bureau itself. Angela called for an emergency meeting with her top advisors, determined to set the course for reform. She was clear in her message. We cannot let this define us. We cannot allow the actions of a few to taint the good work that so many of you do every day. But we also cannot ignore the reality that something is broken and it must be fixed. Her voice was firm, but the weight of the situation was not lost on anyone in the room. They all understood the magnitude of the moment. Angela had been tasked with leading one of the most important institutions in the country, and now she was responsible for ensuring that it could live up to its ideals of justice, fairness, and equality. The reform process was slow, but Angela was persistent. It involved extensive retraining, increased transparency, and a complete overhaul of internal procedures. The Bureau would be held to a higher standard, and those who did not meet that standard would be held accountable, no matter their rank. But Angela also knew that changing the culture of an institution as large and entrenched as the FBI would take more than just policy changes. It would take time, it would take patience, and most importantly, it would take the collective will of everyone within the Bureau. As the weeks turned into months, Angela found herself facing even more scrutiny. Her decisions were questioned, her leadership was tested, and her every move was analyzed. But she remained steadfast, knowing that the path to change was never easy and never quick. It was a long, difficult road, but one that she had already started walking. The story of Officer Sullivan had become a symbol for many. It was a story of personal failure, yes, but it was also a story of redemption, a story of how someone could rise from the ashes of their mistakes and make things right. Sullivan had not yet come to terms with his actions, but Angela was determined that, through the ongoing reform, he would be held accountable. The entire country was watching, and Angela was determined to prove that true leadership was not about avoiding failure, but about confronting it head-on, learning from it, and ensuring that it was never repeated. As the FBI moved forward, the lessons learned from Sullivan's case would be a constant reminder of the work still to be done. For Angela, this was just another chapter in her journey, one that would ultimately shape the future of the Bureau and set a precedent for what true justice and accountability looked like. As the months passed, the reforms Angela had set in motion began to take root, but the journey was far from over. The FBI, like any large organization, had deep-seated issues that could not be undone overnight. Yet, Angela saw progress, even if it came in small, incremental steps. She knew that the road to true reform was a marathon, not a sprint. She had faced resistance from some corners of the Bureau, from those who had grown comfortable in the status quo, and from others who felt threatened by the changes she was championing. But Angela was undeterred. She had spent her career fighting for justice, and she was prepared to continue that fight within the very organization she now led. The public's perception of the FBI had shifted as well. The media, once quick to criticize the Bureau's failures, had begun to see the genuine efforts being made to correct the wrongs of the past. Stories began to surface about the improvements Angela had put in place. New training programs designed to root out bias, new accountability measures to ensure transparency, and a renewed focus on integrity at every level of the Bureau. Still, there were those who questioned whether these changes would be enough. The public demanded results, and while Angela's reforms were vital, she knew that there would always be skeptics. She could not afford to be complacent. The pressure to deliver on her promises weighed heavily on her shoulders, but Angela had always thrived under pressure. She understood that leadership meant making tough decisions, even when they were unpopular. One of the most challenging decisions she had to make in the wake of the Sullivan incident was how to address the remaining officers involved in corruption. While Sullivan was the most high-profile case, the investigation had revealed a network of individuals who had abused their power for personal gain. Angela knew that removing them from the Bureau was necessary, but it was a decision that would shake the organization to its core. The internal conflict within the FBI was palpable. Employees who had worked alongside these officers for years were now forced to confront the reality that their colleagues had betrayed their trust. But Angela remained resolute. She knew that the integrity of the entire Bureau depended on rooting out these bad actors and ensuring that the FBI could no longer be a haven for corruption. The public was watching closely. The media continued to report on the ongoing changes within the Bureau, and there was a mix of hope and skepticism in the air. Angela knew that every step she took would be scrutinized, but she also knew that she couldn't afford to back down. She had to set an example, not just for her colleagues, but for the entire nation. Despite the challenges, Angela found moments of encouragement. She began to see shifts in the attitudes of the officers who had initially resisted the reforms. Some came forward, admitting their past mistakes and asking for guidance on how they could improve. Others, who had once been complicit in the system, now embraced the changes wholeheartedly. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without setbacks, but it was progress. Angela's work was far from over. She had learned that true leadership wasn't just about achieving the immediate goals. It was about setting a foundation for long-term change. Every day, every decision, and every action she took mattered. As she stood in her office late one night, reviewing reports and planning the next phase of the Bureau's transformation, Angela knew that she had made the right choice. The challenges were great, but so was her determination. She had a vision for the future of the FBI, one built on integrity, fairness, and accountability. And no matter the obstacles, she was prepared to see that vision through, for the good of the Bureau and for the good of the country.